Today, we're going to walk through how your brain is actually wired to misfire and what you can do about it in daily practice.
What's up and welcome to Sam Miller Science, where you're joining me just over a decade into my personal journey of working to bridge the gap between metabolism, macros, muscle, and medicine, all while helping coaches scale the impact that they desire and deserve. If you are here, thank you so much for listening and for trusting me to help you elevate your coaching game or to lead you in your transformation to realize your true potential. In either case, each week I'll be sharing my methods, models, and message to serve as leverage for your specific goals. Without further ado, let's get on to today's show.
Before you beat yourself up for your last bad decision, pause for a minute. What if that wasn't a character flaw, but a design flaw in the hardware that you're using? Today, we're going to walk through how your brain is actually wired to misfire and what you can do about it in daily practice, because everyone's made a bad decision in their lifetime. Maybe you stuck with a training program or a diet that clearly wasn't working for you because you'd already invested months of effort. Maybe you've poured money into a failing business strategy because you'd already spent so much on it. The same could be said for time in a bad relationship. These aren't isolated incidents of poor judgment. Instead, they're predictable. They're systematic errors in human decision-making. And today, we're not here to talk about them as moral failures or as a lack of discipline. Instead, we're here to discuss them as logical, predictable outputs of a flawed process and what to do about it. Inside today's podcast, we're unpacking the science of bad decisions. We're going to move through 5 distinct pillars that govern our choices. First, we'll look at our fundamental biological and physiological constraints, how things like sleep, stress, and blood sugar dictate the quality of our thinking. Next, we'll dive into the world of behavioral economics. This is where internal logic is revealed to be anything but logical. And third, we'll explore the realm of psychology and even when humans are predictably irrational. Fourth, we'll examine the immense power of social and cultural reinforcement. And finally, we'll land on the most critical and empowering pillar, and that's systems, environment, and structural design in your daily life. Our goal here is not to become perfect, infallible decision makers. That's an impossible standard that would never work out. The goal is to understand systems that we operate within so we can design better ones. This is about moving from a place of self-criticism to one of system criticism. So let's begin. So our first pillar of decision-making is biological and physiological constraints. Before we even get to the level of conscious thought, our biology is setting the stage for the quality of our decisions. You simply cannot run high-level cognitive software on corrupted hardware. Let's start with the most common and chronically abused biological and physiological variable, and that is sleep. We often think of fatigue as just a physical issue, or maybe I need to caffeinate more, but it's actually the most profound impact is on our cognitive performance. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for planning, complex decision-making, and impulse control, essentially the CEO of our brain, is incredibly vulnerable to fatigue. Research has demonstrated that just a single night of sleep deprivation can significantly impair executive function. A 2019 study published in the Biology of Sport found that after a night of no sleep, the subject's ability to perform tasks requiring executive function deteriorated significantly. This is a critical distinction. It's not that you can't do things when you're tired, it's that you can't decide all that well. Now let's consider blood sugar. We tend to view it simply as energy for our cells or powering through a hard workout, but from a decision-making perspective, it's much more than that. It acts as a vital resource and basically a signal for your brain. A 2018 review in the Frontiers in Psychology explains that our brain is constantly forecasting our energy budget. When blood glucose becomes unstable, the brain perceives a resource crisis. Now, this is obviously when someone's not in a state of ketosis. In this state, our decision-making horizon shrinks in this low blood sugar environment. The brain shifts priorities from solving the immediate perceived threat of low resources, and this triggers a powerful preference for immediate rewards over long-term planning. That sudden craving for that higher sugar snack isn't always a failure of willpower. It's a biological and physiological imperative triggered by a system that believes it's facing an energy shortage. Your brain is designed to prioritize immediate survival, not your long-term goal of fat loss or delayed gratification. Finally, let's layer in some stress. When we're under pressure, our brain doesn't just get a little bit more emotional. It fundamentally changes its entire operating system. This is well known as a fight or flight response, and it typically shifts us from our slow, deliberate, and analytical reasoning, or basically systems two thinking, to our fast, intuitive, and habitual responses, which some people refer to as system one. A 2016 review in the Neurobiology of Stress calls this the stress-induced deliberation to intuition model. Under stress, activity activity in the prefrontal cortex diminishes, while the more primitive, reactive emotional areas of the brain, like the amygdala, become exaggerated. We become less likely to adjust our initial judgments and more likely to rely on gut feelings or instincts. These responses are heavily biased towards threat detection and immediate action, not optimal, nuanced, long-term strategy. So to summarize this first pillar, our biology and physiology creates a strict set of constraints. When we're tired, or when our blood sugar is unstable, or when we're under a high degree of stress, our capacity for high-quality, future-oriented decisions is physiologically and predictably diminished. And we don't want to make long-term decisions based on short-term physiology. Now, let's talk a little bit about the behavioral economics of this. So let's assume we've managed our physiology and our biology. We're well rested, we're well fed and calm. Even on a good day, the logic we use to make choices is often fundamentally flawed. This brings us to a fascinating world, which is known as the study of behavioral economics. One of the most powerful and pervasive biases is the sunk cost fallacy. This is basically our tendency to continue to endeavor, not because it makes rational sense anymore, but because we've invested resources, time, money, or effort or feelings that we can't get back. This isn't just a quirky habit. It's rooted in a deep-seated cognitive bias known as loss aversion. So this foundational work by Kahneman and Tversky, and later confirmed in numerous studies, shows that we feel the pain of a loss about twice as powerfully as we feel the pleasure of an equivalent gain. Now, if you think about that, basically abandoning a failing project or a bad investment forces us to confront and accept a loss. To avoid that pain, we irrationally continue escalating our commitment in the hope that somehow we can turn it around and avoid realizing a loss. And we see this in bad relationships, bad mentorships, bad business investments, and more. A rational decision maker would only consider the current marginal costs and benefits, but our internal accounting systems are not always rational. It's hopelessly biased by what we've already spent or invested. You already know I'm not interested in turning you into another macro robot or rep counter in the gym. If you've been listening for a while, it's because you care about doing the work related to the health and fitness industry the right way, an evidence-based way, an ethical way, and something that's actually helpful for real humans who have real lives, and sometimes they've got messy health histories. So if you've been nodding along to any of my episodes, things on peptides or GLP-1s, gut issues, hormone dysfunction, and more, and you've ever thought, I get the concepts when I hear them in the podcast, but I want to actually see the system of how to apply this with real clients, then you're going to want to check out my Advanced Practice Nutrition Intensive. This is a live workshop for nutrition coaches who already resonate with the work that I do here on the show, and they just want to go a little bit deeper and learn how to turn these client cases into better outcomes, referrals for their business, and just feel more stable and confident overall. So if you're ready to take the next step and talk about what we talk about every week and actually integrate it into what you do as a coach, grab a spot in the next Advanced Practice Nutrition Intensive. The link is in the description. Without further ado, let's jump back into today's podcast. This is closely related to another powerful force, and that's the status quo bias. This is true in terms of physiology, but it's also true in the behavioral economics world. We have a disproportionate preference for keeping things the same. A landmark 1988 study by Samuelson and Zeckhauser found that a huge number of real-world decisions, from choosing health plans to retirement programs, people overwhelmingly stick with the default option. That's because the status quo feels safe. It's familiar. Choosing a different path requires cognitive effort, and more importantly, it introduces the risk of making the wrong choice and feeling regret. The default option, therefore, becomes the path of least resistance, not because it's the best or most optimal option, but because it's the easiest. So in summary, our internal accounting system is wired to avoid loss and really just stick with what's familiar. This leads us to make decisions based on what we've already done, not what the evidence suggests that we should do next. Now let's talk about predictable irrationality. Beyond these economic biases, our psychological wiring is filled with predictable little glitches, and these can either be exploited by marketers or understood and managed by us in our daily lives. As the behavioral economist Dan Ariely famously titled his book, we are, as humans, predictably irrational. One of the most dominant of these glitches is the present bias. We have a systematic tendency to value rewards in the present moment much more highly than rewards in the future, even if the future reward is objectively larger. This is in the very essence of why we choose the pleasure of hitting the snooze button now over the long-term benefit of a consistent morning routine. A 2011 study in the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior highlighted that the way that choices are framed can dramatically influence the bias. When a choice is presented as, hey, you can have $10 now versus $12 in a week, the now option is very seductive. But if it's framed as, hey, you can have $10 now and nothing later versus nothing now and $12 later, making that zero outcome explicit, people become more patient. The framing alters our temporal attention, making the future outcome a little bit more concrete and salient. This leads us to the power of framing effects, first famously demonstrated by Tversky and Kahneman in 1981. They showed that the way that a choice is presented is often more important than the objective facts of the choice itself. For example, a medical treatment with a 90% survival rate is perceived far more favorably than one with a 10% mortality rate, even though they describe the same medical outcome. Our decisions are not absolute. They are relative to the frame in which they are presented because it impacts how they are perceived. Finally, we have the modern dilemma of choice overload. The psychologist Barry Schwartz, in his book, The Paradox of Choice, argues that while we assume that more choice is always better, an overabundance of options can actually lead to decision paralysis, or some people refer to this as decision fatigue, but it's just the idea that when you have too many choices, we become less likely to choose at all. And even if we do, we tend to be less satisfied with our selection and haunted by the ghosts and the what ifs of all the other options that we could have potentially chosen. This pillar teaches us that the context, the framing, and the sheer number of choices we face can hijack our ability to make a sound decision. Our choices are always relative and exist on a spectrum. They're never made in a vacuum. There's always pros, cons, and trade-offs. The fourth consideration we have here is also very important, and that is a social and cultural reinforcement, because we don't make decisions in a bubble and we're not just operating on planet Earth by ourselves. We're fundamentally social creatures, and that social context is one of the most powerful and often invisible forces shaping our behavior because we can be influenced by other people. The most well-known mechanism here is social proof or social norms, and as documented in the classic conformity experiments by Solomon Asch and popularized by Robert Cialdini, we have a deep-seated need to conform to the group. When we're uncertain as individuals, we look to others, especially similar others, to determine how we should act. We assume that if many people are doing something, it must be the correct thing to do. This is why the influence of similar others and social norms can be so persuasive, especially when it comes to making decisions. But there's a deeper, more powerful form of social influence at play. It's known as identity protective cognition. We don't just passively conform to the group, we actively filter, interpret, and even dismiss objective information if it threatens the core beliefs of our cultural or social tribe. This is where people can really be loyal to those groups. A highly cited 2007 study on risk perception found that our group identity is a more powerful predictor of our beliefs than the facts themselves. This is why two people can look at the same exact scientific data and come to completely opposite conclusions. They're not processing the information to find the objective truth. They're processing it in a way that protects their identity and protects their standing, how they'll be perceived within their group. This is a sobering thought. It means that many of our most deeply held beliefs, our desire to belong, is stronger than our desire to be right. We will often make what is objectively a bad decision on paper if it is the common and accepted decision within our social circles. Next, we have to consider systems and environmental design. And while this is further into the show, this is definitely one of the most important aspects here. I believe this is a practical and empowering pillar for decision making. If our biology is fragile and our psychology is biased and our social circles are overwhelmingly influential, what hope do we have for making good decisions? The hope lies not always in trying harder, but in designing smarter environments. First, we have to understand that our brains are wired for efficiency. And as we've discussed, we operate using two systems, kind of a faster, more automatic or intuitive system that some people refer to as system one, and a slow and deliberate and analytical system or system two. Some people call this thinking fast and slow. Our brains have a powerful bias towards using the automatic system whenever possible, mainly to conserve resources because we are, in essence, cognitive misers. This isn't a flaw. It's basically a feature that allows us to navigate a complex world without being paralyzed by analysis in every single moment. The problem is that our automatic system is highly influenced by the environment and the people around us. The hope lies not in trying to constantly engage our analytical brain, but in designing smarter environments that steer our automatic brain in the right direction and one that's aligned with our goals. This is the brilliant insight behind choice architecture, a concept pioneered by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. The core idea is to design the context in which people make decisions to nudge them slightly towards better outcomes without taking away their freedom to choose in these situations. The evidence is pretty robust. A massive 2022 meta-analysis in the journal PNAS, which reviewed over 200 studies and more than 2 million participants, found that the choice architecture interventions successfully promote behavior change. In the most effective interventions, those were ones that changed the structure of the decisions, such as setting better defaults or changing the placement and availability of options. This is the science that underpins the practical wisdom in books like James Clear's Atomic Habits. The most effective way to improve behavior is not to rely on a finite, and as research suggests, questionable concept of willpower, but to design an environment where the best choice is the easiest choice. This is the power of defaults. This is the power of habit architecture. If you want to eat healthier, don't put yourself in a situation where you have to try to resist poor food choices all the time, or you constantly have temptation in your pantry. It may be wise for a period of time to get it out of your house and put healthier food or better options at eye level. If you want to save more money, don't rely on random chance or, you're disciplined to transfer it each month. Maybe you need to set up an automatic transfer so that it happens in the background without you thinking about it. Because it's not about winning a battle of willpower every single time you open the fridge or your bank account. It's about removing the battle altogether through intelligent system design and environmental structures. So the key point here is to stop trying to be a better decision maker and start becoming a better architect of your environment, because a well-designed system will typically outperform raw discipline and sheer brute force. So let's bring this all together. These 5 pillars and concepts don't operate in isolation. They actually create feedback loops with each other. So for example, a sleep-deprived brain from the first portion of today's episode is going to be more susceptible to the lure of the present bias from pillar 3. When you're operating in a poorly designed environment, your automatic system is much more likely to fall back on the default status quo from pillar 2 and make easier choices, or just do what everyone else is doing from pillar 4 when we're talking about culture and social norms. And here's the most important takeaway from our discussion today. Bad decisions, it's not a moral failing. They are predictable, logical, and we can see why it happens as a result of a complex system that includes your biology, your psychology, your physiology, your social environment, and your physical environment that you live in every single day. The solution, therefore, isn't to blame yourself or to criticize or self-sabotage. It's not about beating yourself up for having a lack of willpower. The solution is a better system design. And for the health professionals listening, this is your highest calling. Your role gives you the ability to not just give your clients information, but to help them become architects of their own lives, to help them design their environment to make better choices, help them manage their biology to support clear thinking, and help them understand their own biases so that they can navigate them clearly without having it creep up every time they go to make a decision. So I'll leave you with this key question. Can you identify one area in your life where you are currently relying on sheer willpower to make the right choice? And ask yourself, how could I potentially redesign this system? Could I change something in my environment or in my daily structures or the patterns that I live in to make the right decision the easy and automatic default decision each day? Because that's where true and sustainable change is found. If you enjoyed this episode or you think someone would benefit, whether it's a friend, follower, client, or just someone in your life who is trying to make better decisions or maybe just avoid some bad ones, please share the show. You can tag me. I'm at Sam Miller Science on just about every major platform. If you're watching on video, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode, and give us a thumbs up on YouTube to support that algorithm and help more like-minded folks find us here. If you're on audio, you can support the show leaving a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen. That helps people to see, as we discussed social proof earlier in this episode, a way that folks understand that this content is worth listening to in a place where they can spend their time to get good evidence-based information and practical experience in the trenches when it comes to their health and their lifestyle. I appreciate you guys tuning in to today's show, and I will talk to you in the next episode. This show is designed to help you translate complex nutrition, fitness, and physiology concepts into leverage for your clients' goals or your own personal goals. This podcast is for online education, meaning this podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice. And no doctor-patient or coach-client relationship is formed through listening to this episode. The use of information in this podcast and the show notes or the reliance on the information provided is done at the listener's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment and is for educational purposes only. Always consult your physician before beginning any exercise program, and users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such condition. By accessing this podcast and any other episode, the listener acknowledges that the entire contents and design of this podcast are the property of Oracle Athletic Science and should not be used or retransmitted without permission of Oracle Athletic Science. This is protected under U.S. and international copyright and trademark laws. Except as where otherwise provided herein, users of this podcast may save and use the information contained in this podcast only for personal or other non-commercial educational purposes. No other use, including without limitation, reproduction, retransmission, or editing of this podcast may be made without prior written permission of Oracle Athletic Science and Sam Miller, which may be requested through the contact information in the show notes. By accessing this podcast, the listener acknowledges that Oracle Athletic Science makes no warranty, guarantee, or representation as to the accuracy or sufficiency of the information featured in this podcast, and coaches and listeners understand that this information may change over time with different research and anecdotal practices in the field. It is the listener's responsibility to stay up to date on this information. As always, this show is designed to help you, and I appreciate you listening to every episode. Simply understand it's for general informational and educational purposes, and we'll talk to you in the next episode.